Poor people shouldn't have children. I am hearing this phrase more and more, especially in the social media discourse, and it is not only an ignorant phrase but also problematic and very dangerous. A lot of people that keep on saying that poor people shouldn't have children, they seek to acknowledge the challenges of raising children in a society where everything has basically become a commodity and you literally need money for even the most basic things. But arriving at this answer is not only unproductive, but it's also a great case of shooting yourself in the foot. Because if capitalism was the only problem we had in society, maybe this could have been a sensible answer. But the reality is we are living in a society that's also racist, patriarchal, ableist, classist, and all these things are intertwining with capitalism. This is exactly what makes this idea of poor people shouldn't have children very dangerous, because it ends up promoting eugenics. Eugenics is an ideology that promotes this idea that only the human beings that have desirable characteristics should be allowed to be in this world. And a few men came up with this ideology. They tried to push it as a scientific thing. They were arguing that these desirable characteristics were decided biologically, but that is definitely a fallacy. This is just a dangerous ideology that is always being used by a few people, most times people in power, to create the kind of societies that they desire to have. And this idea of eugenics is exactly what has been used for a very long time to take the lives of children who are born with these undesirable characteristics, such as disabled children, and in some African cultures taking the lives of twins because twins were seen as demonic. Eugenics doesn't stem from science, it just stems from the fears and desires of greedy human beings. And if we look at the modern world, this ideology is always being pushed by a lot of people who are very racist, and unfortunately a lot of these people tend to be the ones that have the power to actually move the world. This ideology has always been used to target disabled people, people from minority backgrounds, and most especially the poor people, because a lot of these elite people think that being poor is undesirable. They think that poverty is something that they shouldn't have to deal with. That's why a lot of them believe in eliminating poor people, because they are more of a liability to this world. They're not contributing anything to society. That's what they believe, and that's why when you keep on saying things like poor people shouldn't have children, especially if you're an African, you're shooting yourself in the foot, because you are just setting the table for this elite to actually come take you out. Classists think that poor people are undesirable, therefore they shouldn't exist. Racist people think that people with a different skin color are undesirable, therefore they shouldn't exist. Majority of people think that disability is undesirable, therefore disabled people shouldn't exist. You see how it's very easy for you to shoot yourself in the foot? It will get to a point where you're going to be considered undesirable by someone, and if they have the power, they will actually ensure that you stop existing and you don't have the ability to create a lineage. When you look at a lot of countries, a lot of cultures, the people that are considered undesirable tend to be the people that are the poorest. In a lot of Western countries, it's those people whose skin color is unwanted, mostly black people. In a lot of African countries, the people that come from tribes that are considered inferior, most of the times they tend to be the poorest also. And why is this so? Because when you're considered unwanted, it means that there are systemic barriers that are created to ensure that you do not have the same access to resources that will actually help you to have a better life. That's why when you say things like poor people shouldn't have children, you are pushing for an ideology that will wipe entire communities from this planet just because a few people think that these communities shouldn't exist. The main problem here is that a lot of people that are saying this phrase are approaching poverty as an individual issue, and yet it is a systemic issue. Even going further and trying to moralize poverty, trying to believe things like, oh, the poor people, they must have done something wrong, that's why they deserve to be poor. This idea that poor people are just lazy and they just need to work harder for them to get out of poverty, that is not only ignorant, it's also very stupid. And a lot of people that believe in this, they have the luxury of believing that because they refuse to see the privileges that have enabled them to actually never experience poverty. The poverty that we have in the world today is very much engineered. It is not something that exists, it's something that is created by human beings. And we know this is true because when you look at how a lot of governments use resources and money, they are always wasting a lot of it. They are always stealing a lot of it. There is absolutely no reason for poverty to exist except for the fact that there are few people that want poverty to exist. And why? Because when a lot of people in a country are poor, it is easy to control those people because a lot of them are preoccupied with trying to survive that they cannot even fight fight for their own rights. And that is the perfect environment for a lot of these people who are greedy for power. Does it ever make you wonder why a lot of these countries are still pouring a lot of money into feeding the war machine? Like, for them, war is more important than ensuring people are living healthy and balanced lives. Does that make any sense? It doesn't, because they really do not care about ensuring people live good lives, because they just want to control you. When you look at how the West is always trying to pander about how they want to end poverty in Africa, when you look at a lot of their efforts, they want to focus on charity or on ensuring that the poor people in Africa have the resilience to endure their poverty. No one is actually interested in ending poverty, because if they wanted to, it would have ended a long time ago. Instead of saying poor people shouldn't have children, the focus should be on the unequal distribution of resources that we have, and this is a global problem. There's absolutely no reason why a few people are hoarding all the wealth, and then the majority who are actually generating this wealth for the few people are actually getting nothing. The rich keep getting richer, and yet, for the majority who are the working class, they're forced to live with the same wages, even though the cost of living is going up, inflation is going up. But you know what is not going up? The living wages are not going up. The focus should be on ensuring that this wealth that a lot of people are generating for the rich is being properly redistributed into the workforce. You know, the funny thing is that the more we ignore this, the more we are going to find ourselves very soon in a situation where we only have the rich and the poor, because the middle class is going to absolutely disappear. And the people who keep on shouting, oh, the poor shouldn't have children, a lot of them tend to be the middle class. They are not thinking that they could end up being poor in a few years, and they would be the ones that are actually being prevented from having children. You know, the problem with a lot of people is that they always say things thinking that it's never going to affect them. But the reality is that for majority of people, you're closer to poverty than you are to wealth or to being rich. How many people are just one paycheck away from being homeless? And yet, instead of actually talking about the problem here, which is a few people hoarding all the wealth that is being generated by majority of people, they're busy saying that poor people shouldn't have children. You know, a lot of people that say these things believe that the people who are poor are just poor by choice. When in reality, when you are born into a poor environment, it's actually very hard for you to get out of that poor environment. And a lot of the times you're hearing stories of the rags to riches, but in reality, those are very few. But unfortunately, these stories are overemphasized, that it makes you think that a lot more poor people are able to change their lives for the better and become these wealthy millionaires, even though they came from nothing. That is not the reality for majority of poor people. You know, the funny thing is always that people will blame poor people for their poverty, and then the same people will praise the rich for being so hardworking. Yet these rich people, a lot of them are gaining their wealth because they are not paying their taxes. But you know what? The poor person is paying their taxes, even with the little that they have, and yet that is the person that you want to villainize. And I do understand that a lot of people that want to praise the rich, they do so because they think that they will also become rich someday. That's why they don't want to focus on the rich hoarding their wealth, on how they're evading taxes, on how they're opening overseas accounts so that they can hoard more money. You know, the funny thing is that the money that a lot of the rich people have doesn't come back into the economy. It is not helping anyone because they're just hoarding it. That's why they open these overseas accounts, so that the money can just stay there. They literally do not want anyone else to have access to that money. But they're also the ones that are benefiting from all the policies that are supposed to help people. If they want to start a business, it's easier for them. If they want to get a loan, it's easier for them. Yet they're actually not doing anything to help society. And even that hoarding is not enough. They're going ahead and stealing from the common people. They will come to your home and they will grab your land, and there's nothing you can do about it because they can buy the law. These are the problems that we should be focusing on, and yet instead of that, you're focusing on poor people shouldn't have children. You know what I find the most interesting thing here is that when a woman says, I don't want to have children, the same people that say poor people shouldn't have children are the first one to be like, oh no, you cannot do that. The work of a woman is to give birth to a child. This just goes to show that a lot of these people, they just want to control people. They want to control the poor because they see them as inferior. They also want to control women because they see women as inferior. All these kinds of oppressions are actually just the same script. I always just find it so funny when a lot of people cannot put one and one together. I can say I do not want children, and that is okay. But it is not right for me to actually say poor people shouldn't have children. I can say I want to have children, but it is not okay okay for me to say poor people shouldn't have children. It is right to say that parenting is a heavy responsibility, and we need to find a way of qualifying someone as a parent. Maybe we should have a parenting license, for example. But it's not okay for you to just blanket an entire group of people and say, oh, these ones shouldn't have children. I truly believe that no one has the right to prevent someone from doing something, but at the same time, there should be regulations and policies to also keep people in check so that they don't abuse their freedoms. This is probably the conversation that we should be having. What we should be thinking about more here is this idea of poor people. What qualifies as poor? Because what you think is poor in your head is not necessarily what the people that are in power think is poor. And especially when it comes to this idea of having children. If you're saying that having children is expensive, then it also means that the poor that you're thinking in your head is not what is going to be considered poor in relation to having children, because you need a lot of resources to be able to provide a comfortable life for a child. That means that you, who is on social media saying that poor people shouldn't have children, you will probably fall under the bracket of the poor who shouldn't have children. I will not dispute the fact that children who are born into poverty, they suffer a lot, and the amount of suffering that they go through is something that is unfathomable. Do you know what? That suffering is absolutely unavoidable, because the state can come up with policies to ensure that no child that comes into this world goes through any kind of suffering. They can do it. We should have societies that create conducive environments for all children, regardless of the wealth status they come from. Things like universal childcare should be the basis of our communities. Free healthcare, free schooling, they should be the basis, but this is not happening because of the greed of a few people. And instead of focusing on this, you want to punish people for being born into poverty that they have no control over. The main problem here is that the people that are pushing these kinds of narratives do not value the lives of poor people, and they think that they are superior to poor people. And that's why they keep on saying things like poor people shouldn't have children, not knowing that they are promoting ideologies that are going to end up hurting almost everyone in the end. You're giving permission to a few people to close more doors, and then they're going to blame you for not being able to afford to open that door, which should have been open in the first place. And as I said earlier, if you're an African that says that poor people shouldn't have children, you are inviting chaos into our continent, because if you pay any attention, you always see that a lot of Western countries, they consider Africa a poor continent by their own standards. This means that you are giving them permission to say Africans shouldn't exist because they are poor. Africans shouldn't be allowed to give birth to more children because they are poor. You see how problematic that is? This is giving a lot of these Western countries permission to enact programs like forced sterilization, because yes, they believe poor people shouldn't have children. And you know, the funny thing is that the poverty in Africa is engineered by the West to actually ensure that the West retains its glory. If you're being honest, the only reason why the West gets its glory is because of African poverty. That's why they're always trying to sanction African governments that want to be independent, especially economically. We're always complaining about how our African leaders are not even doing anything to create jobs for us in our own countries, but the reality is that they literally cannot, because if they create developments and projects that help us to have jobs, it literally means that the West is going to lose a lot. They do not want us to be producers, they just want us to be consumers. If we take the example of clothing, if we start producing our own clothing from start to finish, where is the West going to find a place to dump their clothing in the name of second-hand clothes? You know, actually, I remember when I was younger, Kenya used to produce its own clothing, but that industry was killed so that it could give birth to second-hand clothing. Africa is literally the dump site for a lot of these Western countries, and if we start being independent economically, they are not going to have the dump site. And that is not good news for them, and they will not allow that to happen. And that's why it is important for a lot of these Western countries to keep Africans poor, because that helps them to retain their Western glory. This is exactly why it's very dangerous for you to say poor people shouldn't have children, especially as an African, because you were just setting the table for you to be eradicated from this planet. Is that what you want?